Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity channel for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. Today is Monday, April 9th, in the year of our Lord, 2018. And as always, it's a blessing to have you joining me from around the world through satellite and high-speed internet. If you aren't ever watching or listening on the go, just to remind you about ABN Sat's app that you can download for free to a number of mobile devices, Apple, Android, and then if you're at home, you can download it for Amazon Fire Stick TV, Apple TV, the Roku. There's a long list of different platforms you can get this app on. Just go to trinitychannel.com/platforms. You'll find all the different ways you can watch this show live. Of course, you may be watching this as a rerun on the Trinity Channel's YouTube channel. If so, we thank you so much for tuning in as well, and we ask that you would get these links and to email them out, put them on social media. Also, feel free to comment. Sometimes we do respond to things that we do read in the comments if people have questions or anything like that. We thank you so much for your interaction and support and for liking the videos and sharing them. And again, just letting people know about the Trinity channel, anyone who has not heard of it yet, and about all the different weekly shows that we do. Colliding Worldviews is just one of them that you will find here on Mondays, of course. Also, Rasha Christie's Truth Matters on Tuesday, Pastor Joseph's The Cross and the Crescent, and then Friday, your Islamic news source, Islam and the News, giving you an hour's worth of news headlines, pictures, videos, and of course commentary that you will never get in the mainstream media. So we thank you so much for your prayers and for your financial support, which allow all of these vital shows to continue every single week. Here on Colliding Worldviews, as you know, I have a different guest with me every single week and a variety of topics. So, of course, it's Islam a lot, but we do a lot of other topics as well. That's always great, giving our audience some different topics that they are interested in, and some topics that people never heard of, but they are interested in it as soon as they learn about it. So we're so grateful to be able to present many different scholars from around the world and different topics. Today, like every other week, we have another important topic, and a topic that really speaks to a lot of people today. They don't really know the worldviews necessarily that are behind this, but they definitely can see this worldview taking place around them, or it's a worldview that is held by certain people. And we definitely come in contact with new people all the time. And we always need to look to the past to find out how that is influencing not only the present, but of course the future as well. Yes, ideas have consequences. That's why it's great to follow good ideas rather than bad ones. But we're here today. Our topic is Nietzsche, Foucault, Postmodernism, and the Death of Humanity. Now, The Death of Humanity, if you have not heard, that's actually a book written by my guest, and my guest is Dr. Richard Weikart. He is a professor of modern European history at California State University, Stanislaus, and he's the author of 6 books, including The Death of Humanity and The Case for Life. That is the book that we are highlighting today in this show. And he shows the way that secular philosophies have eroded the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic. This is the book, again, we'll be discussing today. And also, I want to encourage you to check out his website. It's discovery.org/P/number 37. And that will be on your screen as well. That actually is on Dr. Weikart's website, but it is discovery.org, which he is featured on. So check that out. But I do want to welcome Dr. Richard Weikart to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Tony.
It's always great to have you here, Doctor, and you, as an expert in this field, as well as many others, it's great to have you here to talk about this and how the thinkers of the past have influenced the mind of people today, and of course, their legacy lives on in the way that they think about things, very influential to other people. Some of our viewers out there have never heard of the people that we're going to be talking about today, so I'm very thankful to have you here. How influential are Nietzsche, Foucault, and postmodernism in universities today, whether they are throughout the United States or even maybe internationally as well?
Well, you know, some students at the universities may not have ever heard of Foucault. They've probably heard at least of Nietzsche a little bit. They may never read Nietzsche or Foucault, or they might, actually. Many do, but their professors certainly know about Nietzsche and Foucault, especially those professors in the humanities. It's going to vary from field to field here. Obviously, scientists may not be too excited about Nietzsche and Foucault because they were in some more respects, anti-rationalist, anti-scientific. We'll talk about that as we get into it, I think, a little bit. But certainly in the fields of the humanities, in the arts, in English, and in many other fields, including my own of history, Nietzsche and Foucault and what is referred to today often as postmodernism, which comes out of their ideas, has a powerful impact on the academy. It's really one of the most influential. Now, if we think about the field of philosophy itself, many people refer to ideas coming out of Nietzsche and Foucault and other prominent thinkers that feed into what we call postmodernism today. They will call that continental philosophy because it's had a profound impact on the philosophical schools, especially on the continent of Europe. Foucault was a French thinker. Nietzsche was a German thinker. There's a lot of other existentialist and postmodernist thinkers that come out of the European continent. In the American Academy today, however, most philosophy is what's called analytic, which comes out of the British empirical tradition. So if you talk about the field of philosophy itself, Nietzsche and Foucault maybe aren't quite as influential as they are maybe in some other fields, but even in this case, they're still influential. At my university, continental philosophy actually predominates, but that's a little unusual. A lot of universities, the British empiricism tradition is more important, but nonetheless, these ideas are extremely important, and most scholars know at least something about Nietzsche, Foucault, and if they don't have it directly, then they have it indirectly.
Now, we're so thankful for you, and we're glad that you are a professor at a university, but there are many professors out there who, of course, are looked to by their students, and their students say, hey, they're a professor, they're my teacher, whatever they say must be right. And if there are certain academics out there who are finding maybe bad philosophies as good in some way, and then they promote those philosophies, why are so many academics find these philosophies so appealing?
Well, you know, over the course of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, there's been a gradual process of secularization that's taken place, and it's been most apparent among the intellectual elites. And so the thinkers we're talking about today, Nietzsche and Foucault, and I'm going to maybe mention some others as well, Heidegger and others who were in this tradition from the late 19th century known as existentialism and then on into the postmodernism. They were very anti-clerical, anti-Christian in their orientation. And I think the rebellion against organized religion was going to be one key feature of it. Nietzsche was famous for saying, God is dead, and probably most people have heard of that as one of his sayings. And he was had intense hatred for Christianity. And I think something of this rebellion sometimes appeals to youthful intellectuals. There's a sense in which many young intellectuals are sort of wanting to break with tradition, break with the norms of society. And so when someone comes along like Nietzsche, who says that we just need to, make a clean break with Christianity, make a clean break with much of Western civilization, this has something of an appeal to people who say, oh yeah, this seems like something new. Let's look into this. Let's investigate this. And I think it also appeals to sort of youthful rebellion against parents and authority figures. So Nietzsche was teaching that we need to abandon the morality of the traditional morality of the day and of the adults and parents. And so I think that's another reason why this appeals. There's been this real big push in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially for promoting rebellion against authority. And I think that's another key issue that appeals. The throwing off of morality also appeals in the sense of it caters to the seeking after pleasure and sexual freedom and things like that. And so these things, I think, all tie into the appeal of Nietzsche and his forms of philosophy, and then as well as Foucault. Interestingly, Foucault himself was a homosexual, and I believe his philosophy sort of in part is shaped by that, in that he's trying to, in his day, he was facing off against the norms of Catholicism in France and a lot of opposition to homosexuality. So there's ways in which, again, he's trying to throw off what he sees as the tyrannical yoke of traditional morality in the past.
And how about when it comes to Nietzsche? How did his upbringing influence his philosophy?
Well, this sort of fits right into what I was just talking about the uh, rebellion against authority, because Nietzsche's father was a pastor who was of pietist persuasion, so fairly orthodox in his theology. His father died, though, when he was young, and he was raised mostly then by women, his mother and some other women in the household. But by the time he became a young man, he totally rebelled against that kind of upbringing, and obviously totally cast off Christianity, and basically had utter disdain for everything that it stood for. And again, I think a lot of it was shaped by his upbringing, the way he was raised, at least in the sense of his rejection of it. It's seen as just a uh, just a hatred of the way that he saw himself being raised. And interesting, this is not just characteristic of Nietzsche. This is actually characteristic of quite a few German thinkers in the late 18th and on to the early 19th century. In fact, it's kind of phenomenal, actually, how many of them were raised in pietist households. Pietists were people who had a very heartfelt kind of religion. Immanuel Kant was raised in a pietist household, and there were quite a number of other German thinkers who were raised in had a kind of strict pietist upbringing, but then they rebelled against that strict religious upbringing that they had.
This is interesting too. I mean, we see different famous atheists and stuff with the same kind of background. It's like, I mean, even Hitler, who you're an expert on, had this religious quote unquote upbringing just to later reject it. They're inoculated to it because they were never, of course, saved in the first place. It's more of like, oh yeah, religion, I tried that, I grew up around that. And they have this new way of thinking, this new philosophy, quote unquote. Why was the philosophy of Nietzsche and his followers called existentialism?
Okay, the term existentialism came out of the idea that Jean-Paul Sartre, who was himself an existentialist thinker, posited that existence precedes essence. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that the way that a human being does not have any fixed being or essence that makes it what it is. So some people would say, well, humans are what they are because of their heredity. The existentialists would say, no, they're not what they are because of their heredity or because of their biological makeup. And then other people would say, well, people are what they are because of their environment, their education, their upbringing. And the existentialists would say, no, they're not what they are because of their education and upbringing. They are what they are because of free choices that humans make. So they saw this as liberating. They saw this as promoting human freedom. They were trying to break away from scientific ideas of determinism, that is, that human behavior is just determined by either your biology or your environment. Instead, they said, no, we are radically free. We can choose who we want to become. We can choose who we are. And so that's what they meant when they said that existence precedes essence. By existence, they meant the free choices that we make, the way that we actually act, the way that we behave. So we decide this on our own. That defines who we are. So they saw this as just incredibly liberating from all the strictures of morality, because, again, we can make up our own way of life. We decide. It's not based upon what God says. It's not based on who you are more biologically. It's not based upon what your parents taught you. It's based upon what you want to do. And so, again, this becomes a situation where, sort of from my perspective, my worldview perspective, is incredible selfishness. If I want to do what I want to do, and then I'm going to throw a tantrum if I can't get my way, but I'm going to get my way. And so this becomes, in a sense, again, fits into this rebellious nature that I was talking about earlier as well. So existentialism then was defined as this notion that you can freely choose who you are.
And what are the implications of Nietzsche's philosophy for morality and human rights?
I think I've already indicated this to some degree, but basically Nietzsche claimed that to speak of right and wrong per se makes no sense at all. That's almost a direct quote, by the way, out of his book, Genealogy of Morals. He wrote extensively about morality in his book, The Genealogy of Morals, and also in other of his works. And he argued that morality is invented by humans, that we create morality, that it's not something imposed on us by God. He didn't believe there was a God, so he said, there's no God, so God can't impose morality on us. And he also didn't believe that society as a construct should be able to impose morality on people. He saw that the individual as being creative and being able to freely create morality. Now, what he actually thought happened ultimately, though, was he thought that certain creative individuals, and he was obviously seeing himself as one of these, would create morality and then impose it upon the masses. He had incredible contempt for the masses of people, but he thought that these certain individuals, whom he called the Superman or the Übermensch in the German word, which literally translates overman, often translated Superman, that these creative individuals would create morality, create knowledge, and then they would impose it upon the masses of people who he saw as being uneducated and just needed to be manipulated by the supermen people. So morality then was simply a construct that this educated elite would impose upon the masses, but there's nothing objective about it, Nietzsche thought. It's totally created. And so the same thing is true of human rights. There is no such thing as human rights in the Nietzschean sense, except in the sense of people maybe using that term to try to sort of force their morality on others. That is, the Supermen forcing their views on the other view. You might use terms like human rights to describe that. In fact, Foucault even used the term human rights, even though he didn't believe there were any such things. He used the term human rights when he saw it convenient to try to, as a rhetorical tool to, convince other people of his position, but he didn't really believe there was any such thing as human rights per se. So morality didn't exist in Nietzsche's thinking. It's purely what people create themselves.
Well, Dr. Weikart, I commonly tell people that bad philosophy usually leads to bad theology, and good philosophy usually leads to good theology. They can hear exactly why right now with your answers to these very important questions. When it comes to Nietzsche, he claimed that his philosophy was life-affirming, quote unquote. But was it really?
Yeah, this is an interesting claim because Nietzsche's philosophy, as well as some other philosophies in Germany that were coming around about the same time, are sometimes referred to by Germans as Lebensphilosophie, which literally means life philosophy. And Nietzsche himself used this term about affirming life and such in his writings. But what actually happens, and I've already indicated this a little bit, is that it's really only life affirming in any kind of sense for these creative individuals, the Supermen individuals, but it leads to oppression and death even to the masses. And Nietzsche was very upfront and forthright about this in claiming that he saw it as perfectly legitimate to oppress the masses, to do whatever the Supermen wanted to do to enslave them, or even to ultimately exterminate them. Now, he wasn't calling necessarily for a mass extermination. Again, he probably was more interested in sort of enslavement and using other people as means for the ends of whatever these creative individuals wanted. But still, he was not promoting their life, and he wasn't being life-affirming toward the masses of people for whom he had nothing but contempt.
Mm. How much impact did Nietzsche have on the rise and development of fascism and Nazism?
This has been a very big question of contention among scholars over the past few decades. But it's pretty clear that Nietzsche did have some influence on fascism. It's a little tricky, just like it's sometimes tricky about any kind of intellectual influences, because sometimes there are elements of a person's ideas that get picked up and others that get dropped. And obviously many people are selective about the way that they receive various people. And certainly this is the case with Nietzsche. In fact, Nietzsche in his writings tries not to be systematic at all in his writings, so that it's very easy to just sort of appropriate some little piece of Nietzsche here or there and just sort of forget about the other things. So, for example, just to give one example of this, I'll get to the fascism in just a second, but one example of this is that many feminists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries loved Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche was misogynistic. Nietzsche had contempt for females, but they liked his bashing of Christianity and traditional morality, and they saw this as liberating, and many of them were very secular in their orientation. And so many of them saw Nietzsche in positive light, even though he didn't see them in a very positive light. So the fascists and the Nazis appropriated various elements of Nietzsche, and it seems clear they were pretty heavily influenced by them. For example, Mussolini loved Nietzsche, read him quite avidly. Hitler actually even gave Mussolini a present of the complete works of Nietzsche for one of, I think it was his birthday, if I recall correctly. But he gave him it as a present. And so, I mean, Mussolini just loved Nietzsche, but I think part of what he loved about him was the idea of dominating other people. Mussolini was a very violent man given to domination. He becomes obviously a dictator. So he sees Nietzsche as affirming this sort of stance of domination and dictatorial control. So Mussolini was very entranced with Nietzsche. Hitler is a little bit different. Hitler, in his early days, it's not clear that he read much Nietzsche early on. He read Schopenhauer, who interestingly was also an influence on Nietzsche. And Hitler loved Schopenhauer by his own admission. But he also did buy into many Nietzschean ideas too. And by the 1930s, there's a lot of Nietzschean phrases that get integrated into his speeches and such. And also, while Hitler was in power, he donated money to the Nietzsche archives. There are a number of photographs of Hitler at the Nietzsche archives. In fact, there's one that I have in my book, Hitler's Religion. I have a photo illustration in my book of Hitler across from a bust of Nietzsche where he's looking at it, because Hitler wanted to be associated with Nietzsche. So Hitler certainly thought that Nietzsche was worth promoting and wanted to promote Nietzscheanism during his time, and so did many other Nazis during his time too. There were some Nazis who were not so keen on Nietzsche, but Hitler and people like Rosenberg and others were actually pretty entranced with Nietzsche and saw his philosophy as promoting their ideas of dictatorial rule, of their contempt for the masses, their dispensing with traditional morality, they're getting rid of Christianity, all of which things they looked upon positively.
And that's, now that you mentioned it, that's another book that I did want to let our audience know about if they have not heard of it. Make sure that you pick up Hitler's Religion. That is Dr. Weikart's newest book, how Hitler's beliefs drove the Third Reich. You know, there's many claims that Hitler was a Christian, quote unquote. Dr. Weikart has been here before to dispel that myth. But of course, in his book, you're going to get a lot more information than we can present on one hour show. So I want to encourage you to get The Death of Humanity, also Hitler's Religion, to get a lot of Dr. Weikart's expertise. He is an expert on the Third Reich, and Hitler has been featured in multiple documentaries. But again, get his books as well. Now, we do have to take a break in just about a minute, but I do want to encourage our viewers to go check out Dr. Weikart's page, not only Discovery, but also on his university EDU website. But mainly get his books, because you're going to get a lot of vital, helpful information that's going to help you. Again, we need to study the past in order to hopefully not repeat the future. Unfortunately, if you do study history, you're bound to sit back and watch other people repeat it. But nevertheless, you want to know about how ideas have consequences, how bad philosophies, again, lead to bad theology usually, and good philosophy leads to good theology. Now, when you go and get a degree in philosophy in a secular school, you usually don't really study philosophy. You really study philosophers, people in the past who had different ways of thinking about things. And that's what's so great about going and getting a degree in philosophy at a Christian seminary, is that you actually study philosophy itself. You study ontology, or the study of existence. And of course, talking about the essence and existence, yes, that is very important, and existence does come first, but of course this is grounded in God, not in a humanistic idea of evolution and that, hey, we are supermen or we have the ability to rule over other people. And of course, this is exactly what we saw in the lives of different dictators. Of course, some people say that religion has caused more death in history than anything else. Well, no, if you look to all the different dictators and genocide of the 20th century, 21st century, it's just within the last couple hundred years that we have the largest body counts due to bad ideas. And it's a blessing to have you here with us today with Dr. Weichart, who's an expert in this stuff. We need to take a short break right now, but please stay right where you are. Back in just a couple of minutes with more Colliding Worldviews.
Thank you for watching the Trinity channel. Please consider supporting our ministry and mission. As the Word of God says in Acts 20, verse 35, I have shown you in every way, by laboring like this, that you must support the weak and remember the words of our Lord Jesus, that he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive.
You can help support this ministry by calling us at 248-416-1300 and speaking with a fellow brother and sister of Christ. Help ABN Set TV Ministry and the Trinity Channel today. As it is ABN's mission to go and make disciples of all nations, our discipleship program has spread to several different languages.
Şeyler geçti ve her şey yepyeni oldu değerli kardeşlerim.
Reach out to them. He wants you to break up of every division. تساءل يا رب ماذا تريد أن أفعل؟
مقدس چرا درباره ایمان مسیحی چی صحبت میکنه؟
Khi đi đến đó để mà một cái gọi là
olup İsa Mesih ile yürümedikten sonra
Any man be in Christ, he is a new creature.
كم من مدمنين توقفوا عن الإدمان.
خواهم بود نه خواهم آمد. خواهم بود یعنی هست.
Khi bà trở lại Việt Nam thì thường thì bà nói rằng
Kötü alışkanlıkların, şeytana olan hizmetin, günaha olan düşüklük.
We started out with these languages, but coming soon are even more. Stay tuned to see these programs come to ABN.
Thank you for watching the Trinity channel. Won't you help consider donating and supporting this ministry? As the Word of God says in Luke 21:3-4, so he said, truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had.
You can help support this ministry by sending your donation through the mail. Just address it to ABN Inc. at P.O. Box 724, Walled Lake, Michigan 48390. With your help, we can continue this mission to spread to the entire world.
Friends, welcome back to Colliding Worldviews, where I'm blessed to be joined by Dr. Richard Weichart, a scholar in European history, of course, a scholar in Hitler, the Third Reich, and that's Hitler, just one of the names that we talked about before the break. Of course, talking about Nietzsche and Foucault, and we heard about Mussolini and some different people. Now we're going to bring another name into the mix. I want to ask Dr. Richard Weichart, why did Heidegger support Hitler? When he first, I'm sorry, before that, I ask you that, I have another question. To what extent did Martin Heidegger adopt Nietzsche's philosophy?
Yeah, first of all, Martin Heidegger was one of the most influential philosophers of the entire 20th century. In fact, some people consider him the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. Foucault, who we've also we'll be talking about here in a little bit as well, is probably one of the most influential of the late 20th century. Heidegger was more influential in the early 20th century. Heidegger was a German philosopher. Often he's categorized as an existentialist, but he didn't like that term himself. In fact, he didn't like any term with an ism attached to it because he was trying to break free from rational thought, and he did consider himself a disciple of Nietzsche. He taught about Nietzsche in his university lecture courses and wrote extensively about philosophies that built upon Nietzsche's ideas. But certainly he tried to get rid of the idea of following rationalism. And this is something that Nietzsche had done earlier. Interestingly, Heidegger claimed that he thought that philosophy had gone off the rails with Socrates because he thought the pre-Socratic Greeks had been less rationalistic in their orientation. And since Socrates, he thought they had embraced rationalism. And he thought that was a bad thing. He thought we needed to sort of get back to the pre-Socratics. So he was trying to get rid of the idea that there's any kind of systematic way of thinking and trying to abandon, sort of focusing more on the sort of, I don't want to say intuitions, that's not quite right, but sort of a way of thinking that broke with sort of standard rational ways of thought. And his theories do broadly parallel Nietzsche and Sartre and other existentialist thinkers, in that he thought that we have the ability to make free decisions that shape who we are and such. So Heidegger was going to be building upon Nietzsche's philosophy in embracing his own views. It's kind of remarkable, too, that Heidegger became so popular in early 20th century Germany because his writing is incredibly opaque. In fact, I think Heidegger's writings, and I've read some of them both in the original German and in English translation, and either way, they're incredibly difficult to understand. In fact, I think they're the most difficult philosopher, that, at least that I've ever read, even more difficult than Hegel, if you can imagine that.
And why did Heidegger support Hitler when he first came to power?
Yeah, this is interesting too, because Heidegger himself, even though he was believing that you needed to make choices and that everyone had the ability to make choices, himself was never able to bring himself later on to distance himself from Nazism, even though he'd embraced it early on. After World War II, he basically tried to cover up that he had supported the Nazis. But in the 1990s especially, there were quite a number of scholarly works that came out that showed conclusively that Heidegger had supported Hitler and the Nazi regime, especially in the first year or two of Hitler's ascent to power. So right after Hitler came to power, Heidegger gave speeches where he supported Nazism. He was named the rector of the University of Freiburg. And as rector of the university, which is basically the equivalent of president of the university, he purged Jews from the faculty. He was very anti-Semitic in his outlook. And so Heidegger saw a lot of places of compatibility between him and the Nazis. And he even made comments in the first year in one of his addresses at the University of Freiburg, where he said that Hitler was the man. I mean, he didn't say it quite that way, but essentially that's what he said, that everyone should line up behind Hitler and the Fuhrer, and that he is the destiny of Germany, essentially. So he was very strongly pushing Nazism, although by the mid-1930s and late 1930s, he pretty much was backing away. He didn't ever, he never apologized or never came out against Hitler, but he stopped making pro-Hitler statements. And so it seems like he sort of retreated a little bit from that position. But what's interesting about this whole affair, and certainly when you then compare him with one of his students, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist thinker, is that existentialism didn't really give any moral fulcrum for rejecting Nazism, because if it's just based on your own free choice, then Nazism can be a free choice too. Although that's kind of there's kind of a contradiction here, perhaps, because Nazism was based on biological racism. And Heidegger himself wasn't really a big fan of biological determinism and biological racism. But nonetheless, you can choose what you want to choose. So if you want to choose Nazism, okay. Sartre, interestingly, chose communism. And Sartre was a big fan of Stalin and was promoting Stalinism in the late 1940s and early 1950s before Stalin died. So he was promoting communism and revolution. So what's interesting about this whole episode and thinking about Heidegger and his support for Nazism, and by the way, Heidegger wasn't the only major philosopher that supported Nazism. There were others as well, many of them who later were going to, who were fitting into this sort of existentialist mindset. But Sartre goes in a different direction, supports communists and extremists on the other side of the political spectrum. And sort of the takeaway from this, as far as I can discern it, is that you can choose whatever you want to choose. If you choose communism or Stalin, fine. If you choose Hitler or Nazism, fine. There's no real morality which could say one way or the other that that's wrong, or you have the ability to make your own choices. In fact, the Nietzschean phrase for this was you were supposed to live, and this was the title of one of his books, beyond good and evil. So you're beyond good and evil because there is no fixed good and evil that you can choose from. So you determine it yourself. And so that's why Heidegger then can choose Nazism, Sartre chooses communism, and the rest of us can choose whatever we want to choose morally.
Well, of course, if people don't know the truth, they are prone to fall victim to one of these isms. There are a whole lot of isms out there, and I'm hoping that our viewers are thinking about the fact that we need to be good thinkers as Christians. And it's no surprise that when you look at the dictatorships in the past and the genocides that have taken place, intellectuals, quote unquote, were some of the people who these dictators took out or arrested or whatever, because, hey, if you have good thinkers out there who can influence the masses, well, then that is a drawback to the dictator who wants to just spread their ideology only, their philosophy only, and all of that. Did most existentialists support fascist political views?
Before I get to that, interesting, building upon the point you just made, interestingly, quite a number of people who were the dictators themselves consider themselves intellectuals. Think of Vladimir Lenin, for example. He was an intellectual. And so if you're an intellectual, buying into bad ideas, wrong ideas, and take them in a radical direction, then, you can promote some pretty horrendous philosophies as well. Now, to get to the question you just posed, no, not all existentialists and not all postmodernists embrace any particular political position. But as I think I've made clear, it's because there really isn't any way they could determine what's a good political position or not, because good doesn't exist in any kind of objective kind of sense. So they can pretty much pick and choose whatever seems most congenial to their views that they've developed in whatever kind of way, or their own attitudes that they've developed toward whatever political persuasion they happen to be. So a person could be an existentialist, and postmodernism builds upon existentialist ideas. So postmodernism has sort of similar view of morality. You could be a postmodernist, you can be a existentialist and embrace any particular political position. Now, again, very often, interestingly, it does seem that they move toward more extremist kind of positions, because you can't embrace any kind of position that would suggest that there is some objective morality. I mean, there's obviously a lot of political positions, especially those toward the center of the political spectrum. So, more centrist forms of conservatism or more centrist forms of liberalism. Very often these ideologies do presuppose that there are fixed norms and that there is some kind of objective morality. So it's in the existentialists and postmodernists, I think, do more often tend to move to the extremes politically, one way or the other, either to what's called the radical right or to the radical left. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why they can sort of go all over the map politically. But again, I think they do tend more to the extremes than to the center.
Now, how does postmodernism compare and contrast with existentialism?
Yeah, postmodernism is a movement that began in the second half of the 20th century, and in some ways it's similar. They certainly share similar views of morality, that there's no objective morality, that it's created. Although, interestingly, a lot of postmodernists tend to stress the social construction of morality rather than the individual construction, as the earlier existentialists did. Friedrich Nietzsche was talking about individuals creating reality and such. A lot of the postmodernists think of it more as a social construction of morality. So they will admit that certain things could be moral or not, but not based on any objective norms, but based on whether society says it or not. let me give you an example of this. This sort of goes along with actually all of knowledge, not just morality, by the way, too. Postmodernists think that all knowledge is just a social construct. So Richard Rorty, who was a famous American philosopher, he was at the University of Virginia for a while, and then was at Stanford University toward the end of his career. He made a comment one time that knowledge is what my colleagues let me get away with. So this is the kind of postmodernist vision of knowledge, including moral knowledge, that whatever people, agree upon, that's what it is. And interestingly, sort of the radical postmodernists don't even just think that's true of morality or religion. They think it's true even of science and such. In fact, there was a big flap that came out in the mid-1990s. A guy named Alan Sokal, who was a physicist, was kind of incensed at the postmodernist dismissal of science and scientific knowledge. And so Sokal perpetrated what's known today as the Sokal hoax. As a matter of fact, you can go and Google Sokal hoax, and you'll come up with some hits about this. But what he did is he decided to learn the postmodernist lingo. I mean, they use this really arcane language and rhetoric. And so he learned their lingo. And he wrote this paper trying to show that gravitation wasn't really objective and such. And he got this article that he wrote about it, and he got it published in one of the main postmodernist journals about social theory. After it got published, he then published an article in a different journal exposing it as a hoax and exposing that this was just a bunch of rubbish, what he'd published in this article about gravitational fields and all this kind of stuff. And so the postmodernists got all mad at him because he'd put forward this idea about science and was claiming there's objective science. Sokal then had a number of disputes and debates with various postmodernists at the time. And one of the things that Sokal did was he said, well, if you guys really believe that science is a social construct, then I invite you to come over to my 11th story balcony and please step off and let's just find out if gravitation is just a construct that, is just made up or something. So Sokal was sort of trying to expose this notion of the subjectivity of knowledge and the social creation of knowledge. But this also, this was not, again, they are fighting against even scientific knowledge in the sort of the most radical postmodernists, but certainly all postmodernists are concerned to sort of combat any notion of objective morality. And so they shared this idea, but again, more of a social construct rather than an individual construct.
Well, it's very sad that as Christians, we have to actually make a case for objective truth. If you deny truth, if you deny morality, if you deny objectivity, yes, I mean, there's just a whole lot of different lies out there that people can fall into. That's why we need to continue to share the gospel, continue to declare truth, being objective, not subjective, and that's, oh, this is what I like, this is what I think. But hey, if there is no standard, how can we judge these different societies? How can we say that the Third Reich was bad or that it was wrong if we don't have an objective moral standard by which to judge it by, to say, hey, this has strayed from where it should be? And of course, the denial of truth, the denial of God, or at least the God of the Bible, is the first step to dictatorship and atrocities and genocides and all this stuff. And of course, these philosophies that we're talking about, which of course were propagated by philosophers of the past, who we definitely need to study in order to help not let those ideas spread any more than necessary just for entertainment purposes only or study purposes only. We don't want to see these actually spread to more people, to have these actually be actual beliefs that people hold, which then again will shape their worldview and how they act and treat others and teach others and all that. But you mentioned Foucault earlier. How did his upbringing influence his philosophy?
Yeah, Foucault also, I think, was very similar to Nietzsche in that he was reacting against a good bit of his upbringing. Now, Foucault wasn't raised in a real religious household the way that Nietzsche had been. He was raised in sort of conventional, nominally Catholic household, but more secular in orientation. His father was a physician, however, and Nietzsche was going to have a good deal of rebellion toward his father and parents. In fact, one of the later Nietzsche was going to write about the medical profession, and he wrote books about the psychiatric profession, the medical profession, in which he basically claimed that psychiatric knowledge and such was just socially constructed, and so it doesn't have any objective basis. So when we say a person is insane, that's just sort of that's just the opinion of society oppressing certain people that are different than we are, and such. And so, and partly this was a slam, by the way, at the psychiatric profession, because Foucault himself had seen psychiatrists over his homosexuality. His father had sent him to a psychiatrist, for example, and such. And so there were different ways in which he was reacting to his own upbringing and his father and the other things that were going on within his society at the time. And so he became pretty rebellious against that because of his homosexuality and other rebellious issues. And so I see his philosophy in some ways as mirroring Nietzsche's. And he was very interested in Nietzsche's philosophy as well. He promoted Nietzscheanism. In fact, there's one biographer of Foucault who claims that Foucault's philosophy was Sado-Nietzschean. So that gives you the Nietzsche, but the Sado part, of course, comes from the Marquis de Sade, who was one of the a famous figure in the late 18th century, from which we get the word sadism, because the Marquis de Sade approved of harming other people, torturing other people, if that brings you pleasure. Whatever brings you pleasure is good. And so Foucault was pursuing pleasure and rebelling against the traditional norms that he saw as being constricting and keeping him from pursuing the pleasures that he wanted.
And how did the implications of Foucault's philosophy for morality, what were the implications from his philosophy for morality and human rights?
Was pretty similar to Nietzsche's, in fact, but as I suggested, with this sort of tinge of the Marquis de Sade, in fact, there's some ways in which it maybe is, if you can imagine this, even more anti-human in certain ways. In fact, interestingly, Foucault, no, let me get to this later. In terms of the human rights and morality, Foucault actually uses the term human rights at various times when he's talking about injustices that he sees happening, but he really didn't believe in human rights, and he didn't believe in any kind of justice either. In fact, Foucault once had a debate with Noam Chomsky over some of these issues about justice and morality and revolution and things, and Chomsky and Foucault were both Marxists in their political orientation. They both were revolutionary. They were calling for revolution by the underclasses, the proletariat, and they were trying to have an overthrow of the status quo. And so again, this sort of rebellious attitude that was there in their thinking. So so Chomsky is, not some guy that's, on the right wing or anything like that. He's not some conservative. He's also a very leftist revolutionary in his political orientation. But he and Foucault were having a debate about human nature, and Foucault made comments about how there's no such thing as justice, because Chomsky had made the claim that the purpose of the revolution is to restore justice, to bring the proletariat out of their oppression and to liberate them and such. And Foucault wouldn't have anything to do with that. Foucault said, no way, there is no such thing as justice. He said the point of the revolution is just to exert violence against the status quo and just to smash it and destroy it. And he even said very clearly that he didn't see anything wrong with revolutionary violence and dictatorship, if that's what's necessary. So Foucault took a pretty extremely radical stance, and Chomsky, who himself, again, is a pretty radical leftist himself, said later that he didn't think he was even in the same moral universe or he felt that he wasn't in the same moral universe as Foucault was during this debate. So Foucault just completely abandoned any notion that there's any kind of justice, any kind of human rights, any kind of objective morality. It's all up for grabs. And despite the fact that he was very strongly promoting Marxian revolution, He wasn't doing it because he thought that there was restoring justice. He saw it because he saw it as a tool to just destroy the status quo, which is really his main goal. He was basically pushing for destruction.
Why did Foucault explicitly embrace the death of humanity, quote unquote, and why and how did he glorify suicide?
Yeah, this is interesting because Foucault actually used the term the death of humanity. Foucault actually claimed that because Nietzsche had already shown us the death of God, and he embraced that and he agreed with that, he said that one of the corollaries of that was the death of humanity, that humanity itself dies as a result of that. And so Foucault was promoting a view in which humanity itself would sort of disappear or vanish or die off. And interestingly, his philosophy centered around a search for intense pleasure, but he actually claimed that he hoped that that intense pleasure would ultimately kill him. And he had these fantasies of suicide. In fact, he actually did try to commit suicide a few times when he was a young man. Later in his life, I don't know of any evidence that he tried to commit suicide, but he did later glorify suicide in some of his writings, and he glorified suicide by claiming that if he once said that if he'd ever won the lottery, he would try to set up a suicide clinic where people could come, and he said maybe they could indulge in drugs for a while, you know, to try to find some intense pleasure in their drug use, and then they could commit suicide at this clinic that he was going to set up. So he definitely glorified suicide in his writings and his interviews and such, and ultimately he was himself going to die of AIDS, which was contracted from his homosexual behavior. And there's an interesting story behind that too, which sort of connects to the suicide issue, because there were people that warned him about his homosexual behavior when the AIDS epidemic began. He hung out a lot in San Francisco, in fact. He liked to come to Berkeley, and he had some visiting professorships in Berkeley, and he would hang out in San Francisco in the gay scene there and practice sadomasochistic homosexual activities there. And he was warned by some colleagues about the AIDS epidemic. He actually claimed at first that he thought it was a ruse by conservatives to try to suppress homosexuality, that AIDS was that. Unfortunately for him, he was later going to find out that AIDS is not socially constructed, that it does have some objective reality, and so he was ultimately going to die of AIDS. It's not clear that he actually committed suicide in the sense that he probably did not contract AIDS purposefully, but he did purposefully engage in homosexual activity knowing he could get it. And he actually once said that to die for the sake of loving boys is a good thing, or something along, that's a paraphrase of mine, but he said something along those lines. So there's a sense in which he sort of foretold his own death in that way.
Speaking of objective truth, this is probably the most important question of all. We thank you so much for giving our audience quite the crash course in history of ideas when it comes to this. But how should we as Christians respond to postmodernism?
Yeah, this is a very important question. There's actually been books written by Christian authors sort of taking a variety of approaches. In fact, there's some Christian authors who, and unfortunately in my view, take the view that we've got to embrace postmodernism, because one thing that postmodernism does try to do is celebrate diversity, inclusion, and things, and they're willing to include religious voices in the conversation. So in some sense, unlike maybe some of the scientific rationalists and Enlightenment figures who are sort of out bashing religion and Christianity overtly, and Christians sort of see that, obviously don't like that, the postmodernists sometimes say, yeah, we're open to all sorts of voices in this conversation. However, the problem with that is that they're only open to voices in the conversation that tolerate all the other voices in the conversation, and that are willing to say that everything is subjective, and that no one of these points of view has superiority over any of these other points of view. So there's still an ultimate way that the postmodernist view is obviously diametrically opposed to the view of Jesus, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Postmodernists is saying, no, there's all sorts of knowledge, there's all sorts of ways, there's all sorts of things, and we should just, include everyone, believe whatever you want to, and such. So there's a sense in which postmodernism allows more conversation about religion and Christianity, but it's only if it stays in its bounds of not making any kind of objective claims of objectivity, and not making any claims that it has the truth. So in my view, we need to be aware of these postmodernist philosophies and engage them, but engage them in a way that tries to help them to understand that there are objective realities. And what I think is interesting, and one thing I try to do in my book, Death of Humanity, is I try to show that a lot of secular thinkers, including people who embrace postmodernism, are not consistent. Of course, postmodernists don't claim they have to be consistent, by the way, because they're not rationalists, so they don't even claim that they need to be consistent. But they're not consistent in the sense that they recognize that there are some moral truths. Many of them do recognize that if you ask them, if Hitler, massacring the Jews, was that okay? A lot of them are not going to just sit back and say, oh yeah, that was fine. They're going to say, no, that wasn't okay. Yeah. So I think there's sometimes we can try to point out some of these moral issues and try to get them to, or find out what their moral hot button is. Maybe it's environmental degradation, maybe it's, whatever it is. Try to find what their moral hot button is and say, is someone that opposes that, is that okay? Is it all right for those things to? So try to engage them by showing them that there are moral truths, and that if there are moral truths, then maybe there are truths about ontology and existence of God and other kinds of knowledge as well.
And of course, we can't expect the postmoderns to realize the self-defeatingness of their own view, because they will say that their postmodernism is objectively true. They'll say that it is right and everybody else is wrong. So they don't see the self-defeating nature of their view as a whole. But our viewers have now had a crash course in Nietzsche, Foucault, postmodernism, and the Death of Humanity. Again, the Death of Humanity is a book that was written by Dr. Weikart, so we highly encourage you to get a copy of that book, as well as Hitler's Religion. This will greatly equip you to talk to people about Hitler, because he is someone who is commonly brought up by atheists and skeptics and all of that. But he is seems to be like the one person that is universally okay to hate. So it's really cool to have Dr. Richard Weikart as a scholar in Hitler, to be able to give objective truth in history about what Hitler did and why it is wrong and all of that. Dr. Weikart, it's always a blessing to have you here. Thank you so much for being on Colliding Worldviews once again.
Thanks for having me.
Friends, please get these books that I encourage you to get earlier, and please share this episode with other people as well. Again, you can just get the video link on the Trinity Channel's YouTube channel. I'll be posting it on my Vimeo channel as well. We want to get the information out to everyone, though. People need the shows that we do here on ABN. That's why we thank you so much for your prayers, and we encourage you to support a one-time gift or a monthly amount. You can just set it up through debit card, credit card, checking or savings account. When everyone gives a little bit, that brings in the amount to keep this running. $10,000 per month for each satellite. Yes, we have more than one. We have 3, if not 4 satellites now that we need to pay for every single month. Of course, electricity costs money, and of course the internet to get this out to the world. But the Lord has provided. He's provided through people who see the quality of the shows, who see the necessity to get this information out there. And I ask people to ask themselves, where else can you go to find these shows? Where else can you go where you can hear all these different vital topics? We're not worried about being politically correct, but just correct, and encouraging people to love their neighbors, to share the gospel with them. But at the same time, we don't sugarcoat history. We don't sugarcoat bad theology and bad philosophy and bad worldviews. And that's what you will get here on ABN's Trinity channel, is the truth, which of course opposes all of the lies that are out there. So thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next Monday for another episode of Colliding Worldviews, found only here on ABN's Trinity channel.